You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and I'm Daniel Cinna. Last week, France and Spain unveiled their budgets. President Francois Hollande increased taxes on companies and French households and introduced a controversial 75% tax rate on those earning more than €1 million a year. Mr. Hollande called it France's most important fiscal effort in 30 years. Meanwhile, in Spain, Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy introduced spending cuts and tax rises of €40 billion next year in an effort to cut its deficit. The Spanish Prime Minister also extended a wealth tax and introduced a gambling tax to boost revenues by €4.7 billion over 2 years. But as the latest Spanish unemployment data shows yet another increase, the jobless total rising by nearly 80,000 people, has their budget gone far enough? And will the French budget be enough to reduce their deficit? Well, joining me for today's discussion is Professor Len Shackleton, a Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham. Vincent Forest is a Western Europe analyst from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Vicky Pryce is an economist and former joint head of the UK government's Economic Service. And joining us on the phone is Professor Axel Dreher, the Chair of International and Development Politics at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. I'll start with you, Vincent Forest. Both countries seem to think that it's time for the wealthy to pay up. Do you agree with them?
Yes, to some extent, it's more the case in France than in Spain. In Spain, the pain will be more widespread. You do have spending cuts affecting everybody, which is less the case in France, where Francois Hollande has been focusing much more on the wealthiest.
Professor Len Shackleton from the University of Buckingham, do you agree?
I think it's probably inevitable that the rich are going to pay more, but I don't think it's necessarily a policy which is going to bring very obvious returns. Particularly in France, I think they're going about things the wrong way. I think a wealth tax is just going to drive people over to the UK and to other economies which are perhaps more sympathetic towards people who are making a lot of money.
And Vicky Pryce.
Well, I mean, the real problem is that if you do horizontal cuts, in other words, you expect sort of a large part of the population to suffer, you get to the point that you got to in Greece where it's the middle-income people, it's the pensioners, it's the young who have no way in which they can get any support because unemployment benefits are so low, who suffer hugely, with the result, of course, that protests are increasing in all these places. And what's happening in Spain is that after years of really not doing an awful lot, suddenly the austerity measures are falling on those people who until now, if you like, depended on their grandmother's pension and possibly so the mothers keeping them going. And those cuts in household incomes are going to affect every single sort of person in that family and much more widely, which means really that GDP is going to be very negatively affected in Spain, certainly, and I suspect in France and elsewhere. And the deficit and debt problem will continue.
Professor Axel Dreher from the University of Heidelberg.
Well, I agree to all of these comments, but particularly on the last one, on the other hand, it is absolutely necessary that the tax revenue are based on a broad base. Otherwise, it will simply not be enough revenue. So in France, for example, just taxing the rich will not bring enough money for the crisis to go over. In Spain, apparently, it's put on a broader basis, which is hard but absolutely necessary. And I also agree that this will not be enough to overcome the crisis within any time soon.
What do you think they need to be doing if they're not doing enough to reduce their budget deficit, if we focus on Spain to start off with?
Well, I simply think there is no way to overcome that in a short period of time. It took many years to develop this crisis, and it will take many years to overcome it. And so the necessary way to go is to have austerity measures. Even though it will decrease GDP in the short term, it is the only way to increase it in the long run. But it will take many years. And I don't see any other way to get out of this. So I think that even more austerity is required in order to overcome it in the long run.
Well, maybe. The real problem is, of course, that the debt levels are going to remain very high. And the question for Europe as a whole is whether they're sustainable. And with it comes the whole issue of a banking crisis. We're talking about a banking union, but actually we're in the middle of a crisis which is affecting banks all across Europe. And if we get no growth, if the types of loans that people are receiving become non-performing, which is basically what's going on in a number of places, including Spain, then the cost of keeping those banks going and keeping the economy going becomes even greater. So none of the things that are being announced now, which will mean more austerity, are helping that banking side at all. There needs to be probably a complete rethink, really writing down of debts, and starting afresh in some way. But none of us has really seen a way to achieve that without the pain that will come in the meantime.
I think you could bear in mind that these countries have a different set of problems. I mean, France has has the problem which a lot of countries do of debt and so forth. But Spain has a complex of problems to do with the sclerotic labour market, the banking system, which went overboard for lending on property in a way which France didn't do, for example. And of course Spain has also got the potential of the Catalan situation, where there may be even a breakup of Spain. So that's I don't think we should tar all these countries with the same brush. They have to be looked at in the context of their particular histories and problems.
Vincent Forest.
No, I completely agree with this. I do think, however, that Vicky Pryce is right in saying that if you cut everything, to some extent you affect GDP too much, and therefore public revenue as well. So you do have to find a balance. Otherwise, if you brush everything up, if you just apply one austerity package for the entire Europe, you do destroy first the European economies, European banking system, and the European dream, which is, after all, the main idea behind all that.
Some people are saying that the Spanish budget, the latest one, that they're tapping into this 3 billion emergency fund, but it seemed to be setting the stage for more aid from the EU. Do you agree with them?
Well, more aid from the EU, I don't know. To some extent, I think the problem in Spain is that right now you do have tensions. You do have problems from the housing sector, then the banks, then the regions, then the public sector. Everything is in trouble. You do need European help. However, right now, it's not really accepted by the government, and very soon, when it will happen, the population will not accept it either. You do have problems in Catalonia right now. People are getting angry because you have austerity cuts, you have spending cuts by the government, etc., and everybody's blaming Rajoy. But soon, they will blame Brussels, and this will lead to the same situation as Greece. And from there on, we don't know where to go.
Vicky Pryce?
I think that's absolutely true. We've seen the protests in Greece, and what has happened as a result of this crisis, because the EU leaders have taken so long to do anything, it become worse and worse. With the result that rather than having sort of political union in inverted commas, or moving towards it, even though there may be some steps in terms of banking union, fiscal union, all that sort of stuff, countries are moving further apart. There is this gulf of understanding between them. There's nationalistic sort of fervour developing in many places. You've seen in Greece the rise of the very extreme fascist right wing suddenly, which hadn't really been doing anything very much at all for a very long time. And then, of course, they blame each other. Look at the cartoons that appear in Greece, and we have a German, of course, in our panel, against the Germans. And I'm sure the Germans are writing similar things about the Greeks being lazy and what's the point of helping them. And I think that has really developed into animosity between countries. And suddenly we have this little smaller nation states saying we want to do our own thing because we don't like or trust the politicians at the centre. And that lack of trust is really what's bothering Europe right now.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. Joining me is Professor Len Shackleton from the University of Buckingham, Vincent Forest from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Vicky Pryce, a city economist, and Professor Axel Dreher from the University of Heidelberg.
It's quite ironic that the euro, which was meant to bring the countries of Europe together, achieved the exact opposite. So I'm fully in line with that previous comment. I think this is exactly what's happened. So the Greeks have these animosities against the Germans the other way around. And I think these little steps are exactly the wrong medicine that brought us where we are. And I'm afraid it will continue, that you go all these little steps one by one just to avoid an imminent breakdown. And it will lead to an increase in sentiment in the different countries and to gains for nationalist parties.
Professor Shackleton, do you want to come in here?
Well, I think that one of the problems historically has been the dominance of politics over economics. Most economists warned at the time of the creation of the euro that you were not creating an optimal currency area. There were major problems of convergence, of trying to bring these countries together on different, who were on different growth paths. I mean, the case of Greece is the most, the worst of these, where we know now that the Greek figures which were presented at the time to allow them to meet the Maastricht convergence conditions were fiddled. And, that sort of dominance of political thinking over economics has created all these problems, I think, in the long run.
But others have fiddled too, though. I mean, we have to bear in mind that, Germany did various things as well with its numbers, and France did various things with its numbers, because indeed you're quite right in that it was a political concept. And I've written about it because I've just read this book called Greekonomics, which is actually looking at the periphery countries, not just Greece, but just explaining, what actually happened when the euro was created, that perhaps it was a step too far, it's not an optimal currency area, and all that sort of stuff. But now we're in it. We all know that the costs of getting out of it are going to be pretty horrendous, and Europe will be growing very slowly for a very long period of time if that's the case. How can we avoid it happening anyway is really the issue now where we are. And how can you have the institutions that change all this? And in my view, there has to be a lot more willingness by the European Central Bank and the others to intervene.
I think that's the exact wrong recipe,
right.
Because it would assume that people in certain countries who are on the paying side would accept this. I think the exact opposite will happen. So
you're probably right.
Money, yeah, but that's the problem. The people
yes.
in Germany and in the Netherlands, they don't want this.
Yeah.
If we now have the loose monetary policy from the ECB, if we have the aid packages from the European Union, from the International Monetary Fund, it will just steer further sentiment, and so it will lead in the end, in 3 years, 5 years, to a much larger disaster than if we would react now. If we would really think now what is the right thing to do. And even taking account the substantial costs of now letting some countries leaving the Eurozone have to be weighed against the much larger potential costs that come in 3 or 5 years if we fiddle on like this and overcoming the crisis in the short run, probably.
There is a lot of talk about countries leaving the Eurozone, obviously Greece being the main one that a lot of people are talking about. Is it really likely? Is this all a waste of time talking about countries leaving the Euro and leaving the Eurozone?
I think it will never happen because the politicians in countries like Germany, France will not allow it to happen. And so they will do all these incremental steps to take whatever it needs to keep them in the Eurozone, which is not to the good of anyone. It's not good for Greeks who have to be much more recessionary packages than they would have to be leaving the Eurozone, at least for a while, or having an additional drachma currency for a while.
Vincent Forest, do you agree that we're not really going to see anyone leaving, or could we have, as we just heard from Professor Dreher, a kind of suspension of Greece from the Eurozone for a certain amount of time?
I'm not really sure. Well, what we're talking about is if one country leaves, then the Union, the Eurozone, has lost somebody, and the first thing that markets will think is, who's next? And there will be others. Because if Greece leaves, there's a case for Portugal to leave. There's a case for Ireland to leave. There's a case for Spain. There's a case for everybody to leave. We've said before that Eurozone is not a zone, is not homogeneous. So in a sense, it is only the aggregation of different countries. So there is a case for no euro. So if you start with one country leaving, you destroy the entire idea, which is we are different, but we can't be together. You can't be wrong, you can't be right. But in a sense, by just having Greece leaving, you destroy the Eurozone. So
Could we not make an exception? Could we not have Greece as we just sever off Greece and everyone else has to stick together?
Yes, but Greece can be an exception, but then every country is an exception because no country is like the other one. It's not like, it's the case also for the US, for every currency union. These are always the aggregation of different economies. You always can make a case for one country or more to leave. So
some countries fit together better than others, and so apparently this is not the case for Greece. But one really needs to decide now what this currency union should look like and what the political union should look like, and then be really determined. I should have done that in the beginning.
Which is exactly that. That's exactly what they're saying. They're saying we are different, we don't necessarily fit together, but we will stick together. That's the decision they've been taking for 2 years now. So I think I expect them to continue doing exactly what is needed for these 17 countries to keep the same currency. Yeah. However, it doesn't mean that it's easy, that it works very well. You said earlier, Professor, that you basically have the choice between resentment in the periphery and resentment a few years later in the core countries, if you can talk like that. Resentment in the periphery comes from the medicine we're imposing on them, austerity, spending cuts, etc. Therefore, they're angry. If you save them now, if you bail them out, if I follow your thought, is what happens is that in a few years' time, the Germans, the Finns, whoever who pay basically will be angry. So you have a choice between making one angry or the other. But the point is, if you do make the Greeks, the Spaniards, etc., if you help them now, you can maybe solve the crisis and have the Germans happy in a few years' time if you have growth.
Professor Shackleton, let's bring you in here.
Well, I would never say never about countries leaving the Eurozone. I think historically, where you've had currency unions which have been botched together in this way, they have eventually fallen apart. And this is obviously the biggest one there's ever been, but it's not immune to the sort of forces which will tear this apart. And it's interesting, actually, that you were speaking there, Vincent, about the weak countries leaving. I mean, I've often think about a scenario where, in fact, the dominant countries leave, where Germany and the Netherlands and Finland and so forth decide they don't want to be in this game anymore. They will form a tighter euro themselves and let the other countries go hang. I mean, that's a possibility which I don't think has been talked about enough.
Well, I mean,
that's what I meant with this increasing sentiment, that some of these countries in the end will leave if they feel that they are paying too much.
Yeah.
And I think the basic disagreement that we have here is that I don't think that loose money by the ECB and aid packages from Europe can really solve the crisis in the long run. They can help solving it in the short run, but they create so bad incentives in terms of expecting a bailout also in the future. It will distort policies, it will make governments not reform sufficiently in the medium to long run. And so the bigger crisis will come in 5 or 10 years ahead. And that will then be when countries like the Netherlands and Germany will think about leaving the Eurozone.
Sure, Vicky Pryce, let's bring you in here.
Well, I think it's very interesting you say the Netherlands and Germany and possibly Austria and Finland and not France. So we are already thinking of different divisions within Europe. I mean, the French, you say that some countries belong to each other, less than others, if you like, in terms of convergence. France is an obvious example, and yet is right at the centre of Europe, and it's one of the reasons why we have the euro, to bind France and Germany together and have the sort of political unity, if you like, which that brings. So to talk in those terms is actually, if anything, encouraging a lot more of that animosity to develop even further. And I think to a considerable extent, the debate in Germany has forgotten how much Germany itself has benefited from the euro. Its trade with the rest of the Eurozone has increased very significantly. Germany financed quite a lot, in fact, of the house building boom in Spain. The French themselves invested heavily in Greece. A lot of the credit.
True. It is partly true. I mean, if you say the Germans,
it's not
true. The German taxpayer. I mean, it's the German banks. And so nobody would have objections against German banks being now in a position to pay for their mistakes. I mean, as an economist, I would fully agree that those who lend uncautiously, in the end, have to pay for that. But it's not the German taxpayer.
Well, this is very interesting you say that.
Will in the end be held responsible, and that will be the problem.
Well, look at what's going on right now in Spain. It's the Spanish banks, of course, that overextended themselves, helped by the German banks, for example. Yeah. And yet it's the taxpayer who has to fund the problems that have arisen out of the banks misbehaving. Would you suggest that the taxpayer doesn't do that in Spain, and therefore they don't have any austerity packages to deal with it? Because that would be exactly the type of argument you'd now been giving us about what Germany should do.
Well, my point is simply that the German taxpayer or the German voter in the long run will simply not accept this.
Possibly. Well, maybe they'll vote their government down. Maybe there'll be one that can actually explain the benefits that Germany has had. A weak exchange rate. They've been able to do really rather well in terms of exporting to China and elsewhere. And they had the ability over that period as well to develop their own productivity in a very interesting way. They outsourced to Eastern Europe considerably and they lowered their own costs. But they didn't actually go and invest productively anywhere else in Europe.
But even if they did have this history of success, Vicky, is it not still possible now that we can have, as Professor Shackleton just said, that Germany could go, great, we have this great history from you, we increased trade, but now we're leaving?
It could, and I think what the professor is saying is correct, that in fact there could well be an end result, which is that the euro breaks up and a few countries stick together like they did before with the snake, the European exchange rate mechanism. But then, of course, they'll have a very strong exchange rate, and I have no idea what they're going to do in the future in terms of growth. And, of course, in the meantime, the rest of Europe, to which they send most of their exports, are actually not going to be able to buy very much of their goods. And that is going to be having a downward impact on growth in Germany too. And that's what the voters are going to like.
The
Professor Shackleton,
the euro have been very limited. So if you look at most studies, then it's European integration, it's deregulation that increased trade so much, and not the euro. So trade with non-euro countries increased substantially. If you look at the UK, for example, Denmark, so it's not the euro per se that really made trade increase and growth increase.
Vicky Pryce, is there this worry that Vincent had before, that this kind of domino effect, once one country leaves, that there might be more excuses for other countries to leave as well?
Well, I mean, that's the real reason why they should all be there. And reiterate, this was not an optimal currency union. Greece probably should never have joined, and some of the other countries either. So just to listen to what the professor from Germany saying quite correctly. But yes, I mean, the real problem now is because the banking system is so interconnected, one country going, the financial markets are going to push the others out anyway. But what the ECB could do, and rather than talking about spending huge amounts of money, it just needs to demonstrate the willingness that finally there is an institutional framework with a lender of last resort. Countries will be supported, so they're not going to default, if you like, in any big way. That will calm the markets, but then the debt will absolutely need to be restructured. So the institutions that should have been there at the beginning of the euro, which were just forgotten, need to be put in place for it to work in the future.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. Joining me is Professor Len Shackleton from the University of Buckingham, Vincent Forest from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Vicky Pryce, a city economist, and Professor Axel Dreher from the University of Heidelberg. Professor Shackleton, how far can we support these countries? We just heard over the weekend the German opposition telling Chancellor Angela Merkel to come clean, that Greece is going to need help for another 7 or 8 years. How far will the EU support Greece?
Well, essentially, he's saying how far will Germany support Greece, and we've already heard some views on that. It's interesting. Vicky was mentioning earlier on the idea of if a smaller group of core economies like Germany, Austria, etc., broke away, the exchange rate of this new euro, whatever it was, would change, and this might be a reason why Germany would resist such a movement, because it would find that that the value of its currency had risen sharply against other currencies, with all the effects on competitiveness that entails. Well, I mean, that may be true. On the other hand, I don't think Germany is as dependent on the exchange rate being low as some other countries might be, and we've seen that having a lower exchange rate has not helped the UK very much. The UK has not been discussed so far, but it has many of the same problems which we're talking about here. The UK has not gained very significantly in terms of exports from a decline in the value of the pound. So I wouldn't.
Well, you don't know what the counterfactual would have been.
Well, yeah, you never know in economics what the counterfactual would be. But
Vicky, did you want to come in there?
No, I was going to say that of course it does take some time for the impact of the devaluation to have an effect. And at the beginning, companies take it in profits, and they did that for quite some time. Now exports actually have done sort of reasonably well, and the trade deficit is being reduced. But nevertheless, they're not doing
our worst current.
The last figures were actually quite reasonable, but of course imports have also been very high, and I think that's one of the problems that a number of countries have faced. The way that the system is run in terms of, let's say, manufacturing exports, is that through the supply chains, there's so much you have to import before you start exporting again, and of course, energy costs have been very high. For quite some time, although they're coming down a little bit recently. So that has kept quite a lot of imports high, and the net sort of trade balance has not helped the economy in the UK yet. And you're absolutely right. It takes time, and the impact cannot be felt. It's one of the reasons why I don't think there's any point at all in Greece leaving and enjoying supposedly the benefits of a devaluation, because it's just not going to help for a long time, and the only sector really that might benefit is tourism, and you can easily do things by cutting prices instead, very easily. In fact, if you look at unit labour costs in Greece, wages have been cut by about 25 to 30% in the last 4 years. That is huge in terms of getting the economy back into being productive again, so you don't actually need the devaluation.
Vincent, you're nodding your head there to what Vicky says. Do you agree with what you've just heard?
No, I completely agree with the devaluation. But I think, coming back to Germany, I think the main idea of breaking up, if Germany left, there's also a huge political cost. And we seem to forget, I mean, we're no historians, but okay, history has passed, but human beings are still the same. And you do have these cartoons we mentioned before in Greece, etc. So if Germany left, I am scared, and many people are scared, and I think the Germans as well, Merkel, everybody is scared, that the political consequences of that would be huge, dramatic. Even, I mean, we can talk about exchange rates and the impact on the economy, but in the end, the moral and political impact might be even more tremendous. And in the end, these are political leaders, and I do not expect any political leader to be able to carry this kind of burden.
Well, I absolutely agree to this. So the current political leaders in Germany will certainly never accept such steps. I'm absolutely sure on that. But it has always been an elite project in Germany, the euro. And
it's been an elite project everywhere, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, but much more so in Germany, I think, than in some other countries. And so it's not backed by the voters. And so over time, there will be alternatives to the parties in power now, if it goes on for 5 or 10 years. And then the whole political landscape in Germany will change, with parties emerging who value these political costs of leaving the Eurozone much less than the current political leaders.
So can I just ask then, is your view, Professor, that we'll carry on as we are muddling through in a bad way, and then eventually the whole thing will break up?
So I expect this muddling through to go on, to overcome the crisis as it is now in a couple of years, 3 or 4, but without the reforms really necessary to put that on a long-term footing. And then sometime in the future, even harder problems will appear. And then the average German taxpayer will realize how much it has cost him, and then these parties might appear. So I see a long-term failure, but not a short run.
If we follow these projections as we get to the end of this discussion, I want to hear from all of you whether you agree with Professor Dreher. This is what will happen. What are your projections, Vincent Forest?
Well, I'm a bit more optimistic on the political side. I do expect that at some point we will solve the crisis by muddling through. There will be some small incremental steps, ECB having more power, etc. So it's not impossible to overcome this crisis. And then at some point, if things go right, if political leaders manage to actually create a political union, having people agree that, okay, the Germans pay for the Greek, but in France, I mean, the North pays for the South pays for the North. In Italy, it's the same. In every country, it's the same. It's called solidarity. So if at some point people begin to accept that we are a union with some solidarity, we can have some long-term prospects altogether, be happily ever after, if we accept that solidarity is something that goes in the European dream.
Professor Shackleton, happily ever after?
Well, I don't know. Solidarity, of course, it's interesting that Vincent has mentioned solidarity, because you can't even guarantee solidarity within countries, as we're seeing in Spain with the Catalonian thing, possibly even within the UK in relation to Scotland, and there are other regional issues within Europe. So I don't see any time soon people thinking of themselves as European citizens and agreeing to large transfers of funds of the sort which Vincent has in mind there. So I'm kind of with Axel Dreher on this, that I think we will limp along for a considerable period of time. But the project the project of European Monetary Union has been very, very severely damaged. I can't see many of the other countries are currently outside the Eurozone wanting to sign up to the Euro so long as we have this fundamental uncertainty about what is going to happen. But looking down the road 5 or 6 years, I think we will see a change.
And finally, Vicky Pryce.
Well, I think it's very damaging what's going on right now. I mean, Europe isn't growing. In fact, we are in a paralysis situation, and the EU leaders haven't quite helped on this. And my view is they have to put some institutions together which are actually properly believed in, and therefore they will calm the markets. And the second thing, and I'm sorry to say that to the Germans, the ECB is going to have to flood the market with money. It can just print that. Actually, it's going to be the least painful way of resolving the situation. We're really talking about the Greeks having to borrow from the ECB to repay ECB loans. Just write it off. And I think the sooner we move down that route, the better it will be, because otherwise the Eurozone is going to stagnate for a long time.
We're out of time for today's discussion. Thank you very much to Professor Len Shackleton from the University of Buckingham, Vincent Forest from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Vicky Pryce, a city economist, and Professor Axel Dreher from the University of Heidelberg.